line that we see here is within country inequality. And what we see is that currently it has been rising since about 1980, and we're at a level similar to about 100 years ago. If we look at the blue line, which is between country inequality, we see since 1980 this has been experiencing a bit of a decline, partially due to the rise of countries like China, India. But nevertheless, we are still at present around the same level of inequality that we were at 100 years ago. To give you another trend to look at, this graph here relates to biodiversity. It's an index that relates to species abundance, relative abundance in different populations around the world. And basically, we're seeing a drastic decline over time. So as we see temperatures rising, as we see emissions rising, we also see these other trends in things like inequality, biodiversity loss, and perhaps these things are interconnected, or as we're increasingly finding out, they are. So in the recent IPCC AR6 report, they had a section where they had a diagram looking at the overlap between climate change and ecosystems and humans, and how they interact with each other and how they can impact each other. Ecosystems are much more integrated into the AR6 report than previously. And this is showing the start of an increased understanding of interconnectivity between these global challenges such as climate change and different systems around the world. In this AR6 report, they also go into things called compound risks, which is where we see simultaneous hazards such as heat and drought occurring or following each other. And what you find then is that the impacts of these compound risks and compound events are greatly magnified from what they would be usually. And also in the AR6 report, they talk about how climate change impacts relate to and are interconnected with other aspects such as habitat destruction, unsustainable resource use, growing urbanization, and inequality, which we touched on just before. So we might go into a few of these examples, these 4 examples, in a bit more detail. For climate change and habitat destruction, here we see a bunch of elephants. These elephants in 2021 left their habitat in China and went wandering for hundreds of kilometers and became a media spectacle, and also the subject of a lot of cute photography. These wandering elephants left their habitat. Their leaving coincided with a severe drought in the area, while at the same time, the amount of usable space in their native habitat was shrinking and degrading due to human interventions. And this relates to a bigger picture of human-wildlife conflict, where climate change impacts, but also things like increasing urbanization and destruction of nature is bringing wildlife and people into closer proximity, increasing the risk of disaster. Now, in this case, actually, the number of people killed or injured was low, but they still did a lot of damage. So in order to address problems like this, climate change is one aspect, but of course, now we see that you also have to improve habitat suitability where the elephants are. We have to adapt our conservation methods to make them more effective and look at more sustainable ways to put up barriers from or buffers to reduce the risk of human-wildlife conflict. Second example, with climate change and unsustainable resource use. So these pictures are from Lagos, Nigeria. And in Lagos, they're facing increasingly extreme flooding events, and it's becoming an annual occurrence. Now, this is, of course, being linked to climate change impact. However, as you see, there's a guy here bucketing sand. There are other things, human activities that are taking place that are also contributing to these disasters. So in Lagos, the city is actually sinking as well, and the city is growing exponentially and has become one of the largest cities in Africa. While at the same time as they're facing problems with sea level rise, they are exploiting to sustain all this growth and construction, a sand mining industry, which is degrading coastal ecosystems, and they're literally eroding their coastal resilience. Now, this story is not limited to Lagos, and the global demand for sand is driving impacts on ecosystems and also social impacts. And so if we were wanting to address the problem of floods in Lagos, of course, climate change is a major factor. But we also need to look at things like adapting our architecture in the area, looking at participatory waste management to improve drainage systems, and also restoring coastal ecosystems to make them more resilient. The third example I'd like to talk about here, you see a picture of people kayaking in a city. This is actually in New York City, taken during or just in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida, where the hurricane dumped massive amounts of rain on New York City, causing flooding. Now, of course, these extreme rain events are getting attributed to climate change. But the point is that they experienced record amounts of rain. The city was not prepared to cope with such drastic rainfall. While at the same time, as happens in many cities around the world, the most vulnerable people were also the most exposed. And in this case, the most vulnerable people were often immigrants or undocumented migrants that were living in vulnerable areas, housing that was not up to code. And most of the fatalities that occurred from this event were in this demographic. So again, the severity of the storm and trying to mitigate this lies with climate change, but at the same time, we also have to look at restoring urban rivers, trying to improve drainage, trying to address issues of governance around particularly vulnerable and undocumented people. And the last example we'll go into here has to do with climate change and inequality. This photo here is taken from a heat shelter in Canada during a heat wave that occurred in British Columbia. And what we saw here was that in Canada, they experienced record temperatures almost up to 50 degrees centigrade. And again, the governments in this area were caught, I guess, unprepared. They did not have sufficient action plans in place. They did not have infrastructure in place when the heat wave hit in order to cope. And again, we saw the most vulnerable groups were the most impacted: older people, people in poorer areas, people with disabilities. And so these heat waves that we're facing around the world, eventually it won't really be enough to say that we weren't expecting them. So in addition to now taking actions to establish some sort of specific risk reduction authority, like a heat authority, they can also employ infrastructure in the cities, green infrastructure, to try and reduce heat island effect, and look at boosting things like early warning systems. So all of these examples that I've just shown were pulled from the flagship report that we are producing these last years at UNU-EHS called the Interconnected Disaster Risks Report. And we have a website that you can go to there to explore more about this, and also to download the report. And this report is really, it's a science-based media report, we call it. We want it to reach a general audience. And what we're looking to do is look at the root causes of disasters and look at a systemic perspective in order to change the way that people look at disasters, from being these isolated incidents. A cyclone here is not related to a pandemic is not related to biohazards and things, but rather to see them as symptoms of common systemic problems around the world. And the method that we use to do this is we take 10 disasters from the previous year and research into them and look to see how they might be interconnected. And so this set of 10 was from the previous report that we did. And you can see that we also like to diversify our selection. So we don't look at only climactic events or social events, but we also like to look at things to do with biodiversity, etc., and cross-cut different sectors. Now, doing this requires, if you want to get an understanding of interconnectedness, you need a systems thinking approach. And what we started off with was an iceberg model, thinking about a disaster not as the main event itself, something to respond to, but look at it as a symptom, tip of an iceberg. And when we use a forensic approach to dig down into the things that cause this disaster, and then look at the causes of those causes, and we look to dig down to what we call root causes, these societal systems and behaviors that allow a set of events that contribute to vulnerability and eventually lead to a disaster. And what we find is, despite selecting all sorts of different cases, there are common threads, common root causes that interconnect between different types of disasters. And we then look to draw these lines of interconnection. Now, these aren't all the root causes that we found, but for example, it's intuitive to think that climate change touches many of the disasters we see. And so our emission of greenhouse gases is an intuitive root cause. But we also see again and again cases of insufficient risk management, the involvement of global demand pressures driving unsustainable, dangerous practices in different areas, and the undervaluing of environmental costs in our decision making, which also contributes to various types of exposure and vulnerability. So the question then is, if you develop an understanding of interconnectedness, what do you do with it? And in the report, we look at, well, what we say is, disasters are interconnected. The good news is, so are the solutions. So one way that we look at this is how one solution can be used to address many different kinds of risk. So for example, this diagram here belongs to a type of solution we call let nature work, and it has different applications. So it could be ecosystem restoration, rewilding, ecological corridors, basically harnessing the natural function of nature while not getting in its way and allowing natural functions to do their, or to give their benefits in risk reduction. And what we see is that these solutions can apply to many of the cases. And this is important to remember in the design of your solution. So if you were restoring, for example, a forest area to protect against risk of landslide or inundation, if you can be aware of what other risks may be present or what other issues may be present, if you can design that forest restoration to, for example, maximize carbon sequestration benefits, or if you can design that restoration project to maximize socioeconomic benefits for the local community, then you have a better chance of addressing multiple risks. And the second thing to consider is that there's no silver bullet approach. So even though one solution or adaptation approach, if you like, might address different kinds of events, it won't be the only thing you need. And so we develop what we call these solution packages, an integrated set of solutions that are meant to address different facets contributing to different risks. So these icons here on the bottom right represent different disaster cases we have in the report, and to represent the packages visually. We have them sets of different colored halos around each case, each color representing one type of solution. So the porpoise icon there represents the case of the vaquita in Mexico, a species that is practically extinct, right on the verge of extinction. So for example, consuming sustainably is one option to help the vaquita. Aquaculture products, eating sustainably caught seafood will help to reduce fishing pressure. But at the same time, innovations in fishing technology will also help to reduce the risk to this species. However, none of these solutions have a chance of really making inroads unless you also work together with local communities through things like collaborative resource management, empowering local communities, getting them a voice at the table. And so this integration of the different things into a package, we think is an important approach. And it requires increased collaboration. In other words, we're not yet set up well, and I'm also talking about the UN system, to immediately implement these kind of integrated approaches, because every organization has its own speciality. So in the report, for example, in designing these solution packages, we reached out to other organizations like WFP, UNEP, FAO, to try and get their expertise on board, their perspectives, and get them to help us build different facets of these solution packages. And I think I will leave it there. I just wanted to leave you with this picture I saw in a talk on adaptation just recently, and I quite liked it. So I grabbed it and chucked it in here. I mean, you can see on the left, if we're talking about adaptation approaches, you have the theory, how it should look, everything all lined up, well planned, and then practice, how it actually turns out on the right, and it looks quite a bit different. And I think if we think about interconnectivity, one of the reasons, I mean, there are many reasons why adaptation approaches can face challenges, but I think one of the reasons is a lack of understanding of interconnectivity means that you're not so aware of all the externalities that can affect the system that you're trying to implement in your practicing. And so without accounting properly for those things, you can really face some challenges. And so the first step is gaining a better understanding of how interconnected these issues are. And that's what our report aims to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, for your presentation. We've included the link to the full report in the chat for anybody that wants to take a closer look at that. And I'm sure everybody found it very enriching and educational. And it also reinforced something we've seen with previous presentations in these webinars, is how crucial it actually is to take thorough scientific data and research to build our policies, our adaptation strategies, and our solutions. So thank you again. We really appreciate the work that UNU and the Institute for Environment and Human Security is doing to create these knowledge products. We will now move on to commentary from UN Women. Priyanka, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Soraya. I'm going to try and share my screen now. If you can just let me know that it shows up. Is that visible?
Not yet for me.
It should be up now.
It's loading now, but we still can't.
Great, thank you so much.
There we go, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Hello to everyone. It's a huge pleasure to join you all today. My name is Priyanka Teeluck, and I'm here on behalf of UN Women's Disaster Risk Reduction Team. So I'll just start off by thanking the organizers and UN University for the presentation of this report. We very much welcome the perspective you put forward of recognizing and addressing the multidimensional nature of the many crises that we're currently facing, especially when it comes to developing the multidimensional solutions that are needed to meet these challenges. And this holistic approach of taking stock of interlinking drivers and risks that fuel our collective vulnerability is at the heart of our work at UN Women for advancing gender equality, and for our work related to disaster risk reduction, to climate change, and environmental issues overall. And this is because existing gender inequalities, such as discriminatory laws and policies, or less access to finance and technology, these inequalities, among others, disproportionately worsen the impacts of such crises on women and girls. So it then tends to become a bit of a vicious circle, in that these inequalities put women and girls in positions of greater harm, but then also prevent them from accessing the resources or services they might need to protect themselves, to adapt, or to otherwise build resilience to such risks and impacts. So we find gender equality to be very relevant, to be crucial, in fact, as a consideration across all of the drivers and the solutions that have been identified in this report. So I'd like to speak a little bit more about this particular intersection, about the gender inequalities of risk, and how UN Women is bringing this perspective to bear in its work to build the resilience of women's and girls' lives and livelihoods through disaster risk reduction initiatives. So as we are increasingly aware, disasters are not experienced uniformly by everyone in society, and I believe Jack alluded to this as well. And some of the factors that determine how hazards and threats impact people include obviously gender, but also age, disability, race, sexual orientation, income, geography, and other additional socioeconomic factors, which work to shape the extent of vulnerability and exposure that one experiences. And for these reasons, we find that women, young children, and youth are among the most vulnerable to such shocks. Women have a higher rate of mortality in disasters and have different and uneven levels of resilience and capacity to withstand disasters and to recover. We have evidence of women's higher losses in livelihoods and the feminization of poverty in disaster-prone areas, especially among female-headed households. And in the aftermath, excuse me, or rebuilding after a disaster, women tend to be more severely affected than men, particularly in their economic opportunities, and also experience higher rates of gender-based violence following a disaster. And the fact that women and girls tend to depend more on natural resources for their livelihoods also lends itself to this increased vulnerability. And this is very much a cause for concern, because the last 3 years have shown how those on the front lines suffer first and most. The COVID-19 pandemic rolled back decades worth of gains in gender equality. We have seen a sharp rise in gender-based violence, in unpaid care work, job losses, economic insecurity, all of which has affected women and girls more and prevents them from responding to climate change and disaster impacts. So not only is their level of suffering higher, but they're also missing from the table when it comes to making decisions, making policies, or contributing to these kind of interconnected solutions that we're discussing today. And meaningful participation is not only about numbers, but about decision-making power and leadership roles. For example, despite the fact that women comprise nearly 70% of frontline health and social workers, they made up less than 1/4 of all national level COVID-19 committees. And this is our collective loss, because we know from our work and our research that the more women and girls that there are in positions of leadership, the more ambition that we see towards stronger environmental policies and actions. And this is true for both governments and the private sector. So for UN Women, I apologize, I went too fast there. So for UN Women, our approach towards this nexus is first and foremost informed by the overwhelming urgency of the internet-connected crises that we're facing, and the fact that we need to rapidly scale up a whole of society approach and response. And the fact is that while climate and disaster impacts function as threat multipliers, meaning they increase conflict and social tensions and divisions, advancing gender equality has a multiplier effect as well, in that it strengthens cohesion and security, and frequently results in positive benefits that multiply from the household level up to the community, the national and international levels. So I'd like to introduce one program in particular that provides an example of our approach towards gender-responsive interconnected solutions. which is the Women's Resilience to Disasters Program, or the WRD program. The aim of this program is to render the lives and livelihoods of women and girls more resilient to disasters and climate change, and thereby contribute to more sustainable, secure, and thriving communities. So this program brings together all of UN Women's work on disaster risk reduction in 51 countries, which also allows for knowledge and resource sharing across regions and countries. It has two outcomes. Outcome 1 focuses on building gender-responsive systems by increasing knowledge and awareness on the gender dimensions of risk and institutionalizing the systematic collection, use, and reported of disaggregated data. This is an immediate and a practical way of making what is currently invisible visible through the data, evidence, and research that's needed to inform gender-responsive disaster risk reduction policies and programs. The program also targets the absence of women and girls from decision-making spaces and positions of power by leveraging their voice and their leadership for disaster resilience. And this includes initiatives such as training women's organizations on disaster risk reduction, and by ensuring that local women leaders have a voice in global platforms such as the COP and the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction. A key priority of this work is to build those gender-responsive policy frameworks through technical support and advocacy. We also have tools such as the Women's Resilience to Disasters Policy Tracker, which shows the progress that UN member states are making in terms of policy development, and also makes best practices available for all to follow. And the program also makes available the Women's Resilience to Disasters Knowledge Hub, which is the first sort of one-stop shop for gender-related disaster and climate resilience knowledge tools and expertise. So this program is a key component of UN Women's overall approach, where we have observed that women and girls are already creating solutions and building resilience at all levels. What they need is support for their voices and agency, and stronger enabling conditions for their leadership. And this is what informs the foundation of our focus at UN Women. And we do welcome everyone to work with us to elevate and strengthen the voices of women's leaders, because we know that advancing gender equality at the moment is one of the most vital solutions we have for strengthening our collective ability to address the scale of crises that we currently face. I'll stop here, but we'd be happy to answer more questions. And I also have Rahel Steinbach, who is UN Women's Global Coordinator of this program online, to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Priyanka, for adding that additional level of perspective and the importance of taking this approach as well when addressing disaster risks. I will now like to give the floor to Masako Ueda from IOM to also provide an additional perspective from the migration side.
Thank you, Soraya. I'm also trying to, can you hear me?
Yes, I can see and hear you. You can go ahead and share your presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Are you able to see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting IOM to this important discussion. I'm just sorry for this. There is some problem with the presentation on my side. Okay, so thank you. My name is Masako, and I'm the Regional Migration Environment Climate Change Specialist based in Cairo and working for IOM Regional Office for Middle East and North Africa. And I would like to thank the organizer and also two presenters for the very insightful presentation. So first and foremost, we IOM also concur with a number of points which are raised by the presenters. The first presenter about the publication, how the existing vulnerability interact with hazard and how this actually turns hazard into a disaster, and also the importance of multifaceted approach to make the solution effective, and also the importance of interconnectivity lens for long-term resilience. So for IOM, for IOM, the approach to risk reduction also focusing on reducing vulnerability and also building long-term resilience. And through the presentation that I put together for a couple of slides, I would like to introduce IOM's approach for addressing the risk reduction, but also link to the migration, environment, climate change, as well as some practical activity that we are doing on the ground in the Middle East and North Africa. So IOM, we've been, as a UN migration agency, we've been addressing the human mobility linked to the climate change and environment degradation for more than a decade. In the recent years, we are putting increasing emphasis on the inclusion of risk reduction in our approach of addressing migration, environment, climate change. We call it MEC. And this is because the climate-related hazards such as floods and droughts remain the top causes of internal displacement globally. In 2021, IOM has set out the institutional strategy on this MEC for the next 10 years, and with 3 strategic objectives. The first objective is we develop solutions for people to move. We work with the government to strengthen the migration management in the context of climate change to enable safe and regular migration. Second, we develop solutions for people on the move. We provide humanitarian assistance to the vulnerable people who are already on the move, taking into account the importance of anticipatory action and to minimize and better address displacement. And third, we develop solutions for people to stay. We want to and we strive to work for making migration a choice rather than a necessity whenever it's possible by building resilience and addressing the adverse climate drivers. We recognize the different forms and different phases of the mobility within the context of climate change, including displacement, migration, and planned relocation and mobility, and strive to provide comprehensive solutions in line with integrated climate change action. We also acknowledge the interconnectedness of solutions to address human mobility in the context of climate change. Some solutions, looking at the short-term, medium-term, long-term, might have to take place in a sequential manner, but some solutions might have to take place in a concurrent manner. For instance, when developing or supporting the urban development plans to prepare for internal migration, it's also important to work and promote the city's disaster risk reduction plan, taking into account the human mobility considerations. Now I would like to introduce 4 initiatives from the MENA region in line with our strategic approach. The first example is from Sudan. So in Sudan, IOM is implementing a nationwide disaster risk reduction program, and particularly focusing on community-based disaster risk reduction solutions. So in terms of the activity, we are working closely with the community at risk of hazard exacerbated by climate change, particularly by the floods. And we are actually working with the community to undertake a participatory capacity and vulnerability assessment, as well as to work with the community to design an action plan with mitigation measures to decrease the impact of the hazard within the community. In those solutions, we involve men and women equitably. One of the community female members who was involved in activity stated that if the community action plan that they have worked together to be implemented, this will protect the farming land and house from the destruction by the hazard, I mean, especially by the flood, and I will have a better food security for my children. The second example that is from Iraq. In Iraq, since 2018, IOM has been tracking the climate-induced displacement across the 10 governorates, and particularly the displacement caused by the drought condition. So as of mid-December last year, over 68,000 people actually remain displaced because of drought condition. And many of those people who are displaced are already actually impacted by the years of conflict which are unfolding in Iraq. So their pre-existing vulnerability because of the conflict have limited their capacity, coping capacity against the drought condition. So the data and analysis that we actually gather through this tracking help us to identify the governorates most affected by the climate displacement and also plan interventions accordingly, including diversification of the livelihood options in origin communities, addressing the basic needs, and also community cohesion, especially focusing on the host community. And the third example I would like to highlight is from UAE. IOM has recently concluded a country-level analysis on this MEC nexus in the UAE. The analysis covered the links between sudden onset and slow onset events and human mobility in the UAE through the analysis of the quantitative data wherever it was possible and available. The analysis included the MEC Nexus vulnerability analysis with 2020 was a baseline year and the projection for 2040. In this slide, I'm showing the projection for 2040. It's a little bit small font, but it's actually showing the across different hazards, such as flood or riverine floods or storms, the intensity and frequency are expected to increase, and so does the impact on the migrant population, which makes up almost 89% of the UAE population. Where the analysis has confirmed the serious level of population exposure to those hazards, in many instances, accurate data were absent, and also no statistics were currently available in terms of displacement linked to the hazard. The analysis has also revealed that no human mobility consideration are currently taken into account in the existing plans and policy-related climate change and disaster risk reduction. So I am planning to use the finding from the analysis to sensitize the government and the partner to the importance of taking into account the human mobility consideration in such planning. And the final case that I would like to highlight is from our recently concluded regional study focusing on the nexus between water scarcity as one form of climate change impacts and conflict and migration. The study attempted to unpack complex interlinkage of these elements with Sudan and Libya as the focused countries. And one of the key findings gives the insight for one of our strategic objective solution for people to move. IOM promotes that migration can be an effective adaptation strategy in the context of climate change if it takes place in a safe, regular, and orderly manner. This study has unpacked that people consider multiple steps before making a decision to move, even actually for internal rural-urban migration. Furthermore, the study has revealed that people have multiple layers of concerns, even for internal migration, such as ensuring actually sustainable employment, security issue, also living conditions in urban areas, and gender certainly plays a very important role in those concerns. So it is important to make the relevant migration management policies and system responsive to those concerns in order to make that the migration bring the positive outcome for the migrants and families, not only economically, but also socially and human security wise in the context of climate change, so as to actually make sure that migration can be an effective adaptation strategy. Thank you very much. And I will stop here and over to Soraya, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Masako, for also providing this knowledge specific to the Arab region and to the UAE. I would like to invite our attendees, if there are any questions for our panelists, you can go ahead and put them in the chat right now. I don't think we have any so far. In the meantime, I'd like to invite Jack, Priyanka, or Masako, if there's any final considerations you'd like to share.
Yes, thank you. With this Teams environment, I'm not sure if we're ever speaking and being heard, so just let me know if you can't hear. But just from my side, I'd like to thank again the people that were presenting, and I saw many parallels between the work that they're doing and the kind of issues that we're looking at in this report. And so I want to plant the seed of future collaboration where we wanted to reach out, particularly on gender issues and actually also migration issues. So we might be in touch with you on this. But from our side, it's great to see, because UNU is something of a think tank from the UN, and it's great to see interconnected solutions being thought about, taken up, and delivered on the ground.
Thank you, Jack. And we're glad that this platform can allow for identifying potential collaborations, not only with the UN, our UN family, but possibly also beyond. If there are not any other comments, Priyanka, Masako?
Hi, thank you so much. And yes, in complete agreement with what Jack just stated. I think a major issue that we face in our work is that gender tends to be siloed away from the other ministries, and that's the same case for environmental ministries. And that sort of collaborative effort to bridge those silos is really crucial in terms of not just generating this sort of interconnected solution, but also just knowledge, learning, and being able to understand sort of the sphere of influence that we each have and how to combine it in the most effective ways to create the solutions that we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you so much once again for this opportunity. And I fully agree with what Jack mentioned, also Priyanka mentioned. I think it's great to have this discussion. And as Priyanka mentioned about gender actually being kind of like dealt in silo, I mean, in many cases, we also found the human mobility issues, particularly migration. I mean, even internal migration is not always actually taken into account in a discussion of the climate change. I mean, there is an increasing recognition of the displacement in link to the loss and damage, but still actually migration as a positive adaptation strategy is missing in a lot of actually climate change discussions. And obviously, as I actually showed the slide, there are a number of actually considerations we have to make and make sure the system actually respond to the people's concern so that they can actually move in a safe and orderly manner. But I think it's important that we actually keep in mind the both narrative. Yes, displacement occurs because of the climate change and disaster, and it might be actually negative consequences, but at the same time, migration can also be an adaptation strategy. Thank you.
I might just jump back in there if that's okay. I mean, what both of you are saying here reminds me, and also we're leading up to COP28, of course, where we'll be talking more about the global goal for adaptation and what is that adaptation and how do we measure it. But I think that part of this is also what is maladaptation and how do we avoid it. And I think part of the path to maladaptation is the siloing of gender issues, is not considering human mobility issues, because I'm not an expert in the migration space, perhaps as you are, but things like planned and managed retreat is still a slightly uncomfortable conversation in some areas, and getting comfortable with uncomfortable conversations, I think, will be key for getting adaptation right.
Thank you, Jack, and also Masako, Priyanka. We are so grateful you could all join us today. Really enriching, this ongoing conversation we have since the beginning of the year, and that we'll continue to have in the coming months. So with that, thanks again to everybody who joined us, who listened in. As I mentioned, this session will be part of our Library of Knowledge webinars that we have on our YouTube channel. I'll drop the link right now on the chat so you can access it. Thanks again to our panelists. We hope that you can join us for the next session, which will be next Wednesday. It will focus on decarbonization. So at the same time, 2 p.m. UAE. We hope to see you there. And thank you, everybody, again. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Bye.